He was out and gay, but because he was principled in that, this idea of truth, right? He believed in truth over everything. Anything that went against the truth was violence. And so how can I not live that? How can I not live if I believe that every human being should be treated with dignity? If I believe in truth, then how can I lie about how I feel?
It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten.
So we're going to do one more quick round because it's getting late. But this is how I want to intervene on this. In this first round, what you see is the kind of intersection between the civil rights movement and the labor movement in a very, very granular way. And in some ways, Rachelle started in one, came to the other, and the friendships of all of the folks in Rachelle's circle and Barbara Van Blake's circle and Sandy's circle, the friendships were real and the work was even more real than the friendships. And the second kind of intersection here, which I found pretty foundational when I first got to the AFT or the UFT, was that, gay people weren't really a thing that was recognized by the labor movement in the 1970s or the 1980s. Not really a thing. And Sandy would constantly talk about Bayard. It was kind of like hint, hint. You can talk to me about who you are. But the hiddenness of many of us who were gay and not out in the 70s. I mean, a teacher in the 70s, gay, a union person, it was just not, you were going to be run out of the Corps. And what's been interesting, and that's why I kind of want to go through and say this in a very personal way, because I heard this from some of the gay men or queer Black men in the movement right now, who still feel like, oh my God, I'm not accepted as I should be. The conversation we had today in our executive council about the non-binary trans person named Nex, who was effectively murdered, even if it wasn't right when they left the bathroom. Not accepted. But the last thing I'd say about this before I get all of your impressions in a very, we'll have to do this quickly, but I want your sense, is that even with all of that, Bayard was relegated to a back seat. Women were relegated to a back seat in the march too. You see that in the movie as well. But he understood what he needed to do, and he did it. And Reverend King understood what he needed to do and what Bayard needed to do, and he stood up. And I found that last moment of the film both familiar and empowering. And I see people in the room who are saying something similar to me. Familiar in that, oh no, yes, you this last moment in the film was the legacy organizations, but the Black leaders of those organizations, the end of the film, say, we just got invited to the White House and we're going. And there's Bayard. They looked at Bayard, and they were not inviting him.
That's right.
And Bayard was picking up the trash, had a big bag that he's picking up the trash, and he was with, several of the workers who were picking up the trash. And somebody said to him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Why are you picking up the trash?" And his statement was something like, "This is where I belong." With the workers, making sure that everything was back to where it needed to be. And that last moment of basically saying, I'm going to be with the workers.
That's right.
I am going to do this righteous work right now, to borrow a line that Bren and Richard said earlier. And I'm going to be lifting up this righteous work. And that moment was both familiar in terms of, no, you're not invited because you're gay. And Bayard basically turning it around.
That's right.
And saying, I am empowering everyone else. I still cry thinking about it. And so I guess there are some of us up on the stage who, were hidden and spent the beginning of our careers in that way, scared to death. And there are some of us on this stage who knew who Bayard was and completely accepted, and he accepted them, as you could hear. And so I just, in those last couple minutes, I kind of want to just get your kind of raw reactions to how you depicted it, Julian and Bruce, and to Rachelle, and to Lorretta, and to Clay, how you dealt with all these other folks who are like, how do you have a gay guy with you?
I never thought about it because he was the person he was. And he was a teacher. He was openly gay back then. He didn't hide it. So I didn't have an opinion except the person who he was and what he did. For example, he and Barbara Van Blake went to Somalia and came back and spoke before Congress because of the drought and all of that. We worked with Bayard. We didn't see anything about him being gay because he let us know he was gay. He didn't hide it. And so it wasn't for me to make a decision about it. Yes, it was bad times. And it was times that people did say bad things. But my father taught me to respect everybody. And I always thought like that. Bayard taught me stuff that I would never know without living it, and the way that he handled himself. I mean, Bayard wasn't an easy guy now. He didn't take no stuff off you. He was ready. If you were going to fight, he was ready for you. And so therefore, most of the people around that I knew respected him. And I certainly had no opinion at all, except I accepted him for who he was.
Can I do real quick
Yes.
here? Okay, because I know your stories are more in depth than mine. When I came to AFT Randolph Institute, and I will admit this publicly, and there's several of you from the organization that know that I'm telling the truth, there was very little talk about the LGBTQ community inside of our organization. I purposely started doing stuff just to get the reaction at first, because it made me crack up to see some folks going, how did she say that with my mouth because that was a part of our legacy, and we were not going to leave that out. I said that to say this. Now we have 13 LGBTQ chapters across this country. In North Carolina, of one of the places I wanted to mention, and they purposely called themselves the Rustin A. Philip Randolph Institute chapters. So I'm proud of that. And there is no hiding anything about who this institute is. And our folks, because Annie B. Martin used to look at me and say, go ahead and say it again. And we would do exactly that. All the criticism and everything that came with lifting it up, we took it because he had taken it before us. And now we can brag because across this organization of ours, everybody is represented and his legacy is being taught. So I wanted to do that real quick.
I want to say a word first for A. Philip Randolph. Just the way A. Philip Randolph said, it's a matter of collective bargaining, would swirl around him. Rumors, X is gay, your secretary's gay, Paulie Murray, who came out, is gay and worked for him. There was a trade unionist who came out of the ILGWU, very famous woman, gay. People would be whispering scandals. A. Philip Randolph didn't know anything about it. He just plowed through, and those people were never outside of his orbit and were never exiled. It is just a marvel of a man, and Bayard knew it and felt it. The other thing that I want to say about Bayard, not by the time of the Institute, but he had a famous saying. If somebody came to Bayard and said, would you join the ad hoc committee to save squirrels? I'm just making up a name. He would say, my dear, you know that I'm Black. I was a member of the Young Communist League, and I'm a homosexual. Do you want me to do that? It was his, and he thought it was okay. And he was very clear about it, wonderful.
And I'll just add into the discussion that something I heard tonight, Lorretta, you mentioned it, it kept coming up in a very powerful way, is this coalition between the labor movement and the civil rights movement. And of course, Bayard Rustin put together the coalition that made the March on Washington exist, or it would never have happened with Rachelle's help and many others. And he says that line in the end of the film, you either believe in freedom and justice for all or you do not, which reminded me exactly of the incredible Black activist Fannie Lou Hamer's line, nobody's free until everybody's free. And if we don't, all of us, double down on that and put the coalition together again that Bayard had for the march, we're in a heap of trouble in November and the whole thing could go to shit.
Right. So, Julian, you get to bring us home.
Well, I mean, for me, I think that, first of all, this has just been such a privilege to be able to sit up here with the three of you, with the four of you, with all of you, the three of you who knew Bayard. And, there would be no movie. This would not be the movie if I were not able to speak to people who worked with Bayard, who knew Bayard on a personal level. I did close to 20 hours of one-on-one interviews with people who worked with Bayard, who knew Bayard, like Rachelle, who sat down with me for about 9 hours.
You brought food.
I brought food. I did. Well, you learn. Well, and because at that point, I think, Rachelle, you had talked to a lot of people about different Bayard projects, different Bayard things. And, what I learned, this was my first biographical film. I have a research background. I thought I was going to go into academia. And then my thesis mentor said, I think you should be a creative writer. So that's when I went into screenwriting instead, because that's what I loved. but I love the research aspect. And there's only so much you can get sometimes in a history, a biography that you've read. And at the time, there was one really great biography. Forgot who the author of. Yes, D'Amelio. There was the documentary. But for a film, the personal story is everything. And I've written a few projects now about Black gay men, and learning about who they were personally is hard because there's just not a lot of documentation about it, because it's not something that they wrote about necessarily, or the people in their lives have been comfortable speaking about. But I needed that for this movie. I needed to know everything I'd read about Bayard, everything I'd learned about Bayard. He's strong. He is the most generous person that you've ever met. Brilliant, a genius, someone who, he knew how to command attention, all these things. And I'm like, all right, but I know he's human. And I think that the part of him that made him special, that is what I know is there. And I want to, what is it about him that made him who he was? And I had a theory, and I went in, being Black and gay is, everyone's experience is different. But I know that for me, realizing that I was not only a Black man in this country and all the challenges that are well documented that come with being a Black person in this country, being gay when I was younger felt impossible. There was no roadmap for it. There were just certain things as a young man that I didn't think were possible for my life. I limited myself, in my head, until I started to learn more about, other queer people. But I think the thing that scared a lot of us about coming out sometimes is that we didn't want to be seen as just gay. We didn't want that to take over our whole identity, because we're so much more than that. That's right. That's right. So going in and finding who Bayard was, Bayard's not just gay, but that is a piece of him that, unfortunately, because of the way that, because of homophobia, because of how that functions in our society, it affects other parts of your life. It does, in good ways and bad ways. I've learned to look at it as a superpower. And what I learned through talking to Rachelle, through talking to his partner, Walter, especially, is that, W.B. Du Bois, he has his, theory of double consciousness that we have as Black people. We are able to see, society from with a macro vision. We're Black. We can see we can see society more incisively. Let's put it that way. We can see how, it works from the outside because we've been pushed to the margins of it. With Bayard, he had a triple consciousness, right? He's pushed even further to the margins because of his sexuality. As a result, it really sharpens your ability to see what injustice is, right? What it looks like, how it functions, when you are pushed even further to the outside. It was also important for me to just get correct that when I went into it, there was no gay rights in 1963. This was a civil rights movie. And I think that was something that, at the time, I did get a little pushback on. There was no gay rights narrative then. There was no separation between who Bayard was as a gay man and who he was as a Black man, period. So, and the reality is that the story of civil rights, the civil rights story, and the story of, Black gay men, Black queer people, there was basically, before the civil rights movement, Black people were far more accepting of sexual variance than the white community, the larger, the mainstream community. We were. That's just coming out of Reconstruction There was acceptance of sexual variance. There were preachers who were lesbian. There were, preachers who were, who would cross-dress, the kind of pageantry that we see in churches that comes from, that's part of our history. Things changed for us as the civil rights movement started to take hold, because we had to prove we had to prove that we were able to embrace and adopt white patriarchal norms, right? And aggressive homophobia is one of those things, right? Misogyny first, which goes into, not misogyny, but, male supremacy, right? And then, homophobia. So there were certain things, certain parts of ourselves that we had to push out of the way. The aggressive respectability politics of the movement, really, it pushed a lot of us further and further into the closet, as opposed to just the open secret, which is what we had in the Black community. So Bayard existed through that change. So he saw how that, what that looked like for us. And I mean, that was something that was important for me to get in the movie, is that there was no separation between who Bayard was as a Black man and a gay man. Also, he was out and gay, but because he was principled in this idea of truth, right? He believed in truth over everything. Anything that went against the truth was violence. And so how can I not live that? How can I not live if I believe that every human being should be treated with dignity? If I believe in truth, then how can I lie about how I feel, right? So it wasn't the gay pride as we know it now. So the bravery that he had, and again, Walter Nagel really helped me, glean this, is there was that truth, there was that courage. You have this Black gay man who was out in the 40s, 50s, 60s, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have the same scars that closeted Black gay men had. One of the narratives that I really wanted to, counteract about Bayard, was that Bayard did not have close camaraderie with other Black gay men who were in the movement, but also, who were may have been closeted, and he did. And that just was not really been on the record. The reality is that it was not just Bayard who was gay at that time working in the movement. And Bayard actually was a safe haven for a lot of those men and women. And ultimately, the one thing I will say about this film is that this film would not be the film that it is if it were not, I feel like, protected by certain forces. 2013 is when I started researching it. The same year that Barack Obama gave Bayard Rustin posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which meant everything. I was like, oh my gosh, this means, this is going to happen, this movie, everyone's going to know about Bayard. At the time, the movie was set up at another place. It looked like it was going to go forward. There was, it was another director who was a Black gay man who, really protected the script. Then when the project moved, with Lance and Bruce to George, it was protected. I didn't know when I wrote the film that one of the producers of the film would be one of the, not just one of the, top, gay producers in Hollywood, one of the top producers in Hollywood. Wow. It does not get, more prestigious, more than Bruce Cohen.
Yeah, that's right.
And it doesn't.
I thought he was going to say George C. Wolfe.
He's the director.
Oh, he's the director. Tony's gay too.
Yeah, all of us are gay. And Mark Wright, who's the other producer. But I think that for me, I was scared that there were certain things that were going to be ripped out of the story, right? Or that were going to be changed, or I went into it with a pure heart of portraying Bayard as the people who I talked to, which recollections vary. So everyone's idea is not necessarily going to be the idea that came together. But ultimately, like, I think that what did come together was of the kind of collaborative spirit that Bayard was about. And it was protected by people that cared about this story and what it meant to them. And, Bruce, it deserves so much credit for protecting the film, for protecting the filmmaker, for, and obviously Higher Ground as well, you guys' partnership. I just want to thank you because we did not get to work together, because, this is in Hollywood, things happen. It takes 10 years for a film to get made. It's a collaborative process. It changes hands, especially as a writer. You don't know what it's going to look like by the time it makes it to the screen. I was so emotional when I saw the film for the first time, when I saw George's first cut, because because I knew that it was something that I felt that the people who I talked to would be able to be proud of. And that's the thing that was the scariest for me going into writing it, because those people meant something to me.
I just want to say at the end what our audience has been privy to right now is a real discussion about who Bayard was in all of his aspects, from people who knew him and from people who studied him and from people who honored him, from the labor movement, from the civil rights movements, and also through a 2010 through 2024 lens where we still see the oppression of the other.
That's right.
And whether the other is someone who's a Black man, or whether the other is a Jewish socialist from Brooklyn, or whether the other are people from the labor movement, or whether the other are people who are gay and still struggling to be viewed equally in the eyes of others. Today, in 2024, we're starting to have some of those same fights, as Bruce just said, in this country that stem from the fear of the other. And I just want to honor all of you, because this podcast's name was We Were There to Rustin with Love. What you heard tonight was real, honest, unvarnished history and reflections about Bayard the man, Bayard the civil rights leader, Bayard the friend. We didn't talk about Bayard the singer. Bayard the labor activist, Bayard the humanist, and Bayard the freaking amazing organizer.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Bruce and Clay and Julian and Lorretta and Rachelle. Thank you for joining us tonight to give life to Bayard Rustin.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.